Meanwhile, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who before this conflict began had been very upbeat and enthusiastic about joining the NATO military alliance. But on Friday, he lashed out at the NATO military alliance after NATO rejected Ukraine's request to impose a no-fly zone to halt Russia's missile strikes. Now, NATO cited further aggression behind this decision. However, NATO has warned the Russian President Vladimir Putin of fresh sanctions if he does not stop the war. Now, Zelensky has accused the alliance of holding a very weak and a very confused summit in the stand that it has taken against Russia so far.
Сьогодні відбувся саміт НАТО. Слабкий саміт, розгублений саміт. Саміт, на якому видно, що не всі вважають боротьбу за свободу для Європи метою номер один. 9 днів ми бачимо жорстку війну. Руйнують наші міста, обстрілюють наших людей, наших дітей, житлові квартали, церкви, школи, знищують все, що забезпечує нормальне життя, людське життя. І хочуть це продовжувати, знаючи, що нові удари і жертви неминучі. НАТО свідомо ухвалили рішення не закривати небо над Україною.
Now, the American Secretary of State Antony Blinken, in fact, doubled down on NATO's refusal of Ukraine's request, saying that it is their responsibility to ensure that the war does not spill over beyond the Ukrainian borders.
One of the responsibilities we have, even as we are doing everything we can to give the Ukrainian people the means to defend themselves effectively against Russia, we also have a responsibility, as the Secretary General said, to ensure that the war doesn't spill over even beyond Ukraine. The only way to actually implement something like a no-fly zone is to send NATO planes into Ukrainian airspace and to shoot down Russian planes, and that could lead to a full-fledged war in Europe.
Now, even though Russia's invasion into Ukraine has sparked global condemnation and economic sanctions, the West has made it abundantly clear that declaring a no-fly zone in Ukraine is simply off the table. The NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has dismissed plans to move into Ukraine on ground or onto its airspace. Stoltenberg has said that it is NATO's responsibility to avert a war in Europe involving NATO allies.
Allies agree that we should not have NATO planes operating over Ukrainian airspace or NATO troops on Ukrainian territory.
Now, the European Council President Charles Michel has also said that it will be one step too far to reinforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which isn't even a NATO member. Similarly, the United Kingdom's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has ruled out Ukraine's request on Tuesday at a press briefing in Estonia. Now, Johnson stressed that NATO is a defensive military organization, and to shoot at Russian planes was definitely not on its agenda. So let's tell you why Ukraine is asking for a no-fly zone. Remember, Ukraine has in many ways gotten to this conflict because of its desire to join the NATO military alliance. It was in fact led up to it by the NATO. A no-fly zone refers to an airspace where aircrafts of a certain nation cannot fly. No-fly zones are used to protect sensitive or VIP areas, and these include royal residences, sporting events or large gatherings. Militarily, a no-fly zone is meant to stop enemy aircraft. This could, of course, use surveillance, preemptive strikes or shooting at the enemy aircraft. And for NATO, a no-fly zone over Ukraine would effectively mean a direct conflict with Russia in terms of air power. And this is something that the West at this point of time simply cannot afford, because the Russian Air Force is in many ways as good as that the NATO has. For Western countries, any conflict with Russia possibly equals a nuclear war, especially after the Russian president has placed his nuclear forces on high alert. While the West has refused to grant a no-fly zone over Ukraine, interestingly, they've used it before, but they've used it essentially against countries with very little air force to speak of, countries which were not technologically as advanced as the United States and its Western allies. Now remember, in 1991, the American coalition established 2 no-fly zones in Iraq, and that too without a United Nations backing. Remember, the Iraqis simply could not have shot down the American jets they did not have that capability. So the Americans imposed a no-fly zone there. In 1992, again a similar sort of a scenario, but this time around in the Balkans conflict, the United Nations banned unauthorized military flights over the Bosnian airspace. And then in 2011, the United Nations Security Council approved a no-fly zone over Libya, another country that did not have the technological edge that the Russians have. The Bosnian and the Libyan zones were both enforced by NATO forces. And here, in this case, clearly because of the technological superiority that the Russians seem to have, where they can match the NATO military alliance's air force, NATO does not want to get into a conflict with Russians for obvious reasons. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.